Hi guys, you may remember at the beginning of my YouTube channel, my first videos, that I started a beginner series using the Airfix 172 Lightning. I had to stop those videos because I thought I deleted all the video files for the actual build, but actually I've come across them now, so I thought what I'd do is I'll just put them together and just to finish off that little build. Now, just a word of warning here, these were my first videos for YouTube. I'm learning as I'm going, and a lot of the time my head's getting in the way. It's just one of those things that you just don't realise until you videoed it. And so I'm just going to put it up. I'm not going to spend too much time editing or fancying around with it. I'm going to cut out some of the bits where just my head is just getting in the way all the time. So I'm sure you don't want to spend time looking at my head. Maybe some of you do if you like the look of my nice grey hair. But what I'm just going to do, I'm just going to put it into a video. I'll put it into 2 videos. I'm going to cover the first bit, which will look at the this part, which will look at the pilot and how we painted that, and then the second part we'll put it all together and paint it and so on. So maybe 2 or 3 videos, depends how long. So I'll just put it up for you guys that are interested, and so just a word of warning, it's not the best video, and so I'm slowly improving, so hope you enjoy it. So let's look at some of the tools that you're going to need for building your first Airfix model. First of all, you're going to need yourself a good quality sharp knife. Okay, I use a scalpel with a variety of different blades, but you could easily just use a simple craft knife from your hobby store. Absolutely no worries at all. The next thing I use a good pair of tweezers, which help me to put the small parts into places. My sausage fingers can't quite fit into narrow gaps like they used to when I was a small child, so I use the tweezers for attaching very small parts and helping me to attach them and locate them into the right places. A good set of sprue cutters. The sprue cutters are used for getting the plastic off the sprue, and it's important that you have a good set of sharp sprue cutters that are going to easily get the plastic off without making too much mess. Now, you could just get away with using a cheap set of cutters that you might find in a hardware store or a hobby shop, which will cost you not too much money, but I've gone out and bought myself a quite nice set. It's quite important it's quite flat, and when we come on to the modelling and I show you how to take it off the sprue, it's important that you get something with a nice flat edge as opposed to the sort of electrical cutters that have a rounded edge, which means you can't really get into the areas that you want to cut. Sanding sticks. Sanding sticks are used for cleaning up the plastic after you've removed it from the sprue, but also for cleaning up the plastic once you've glued it together. I get my sanding sticks from flooringmodels.co.uk. I've found of all the ones that I've used, these are some of the best that I use, and again, you get what you pay for. They're not that cheap, but a set will last you quite a long time. Failing that, what you could do, you could go to your local supermarket and try to find yourself some nail files and things like that. I guess they'll work okay. I've never really tried them. Then we come on to our glue. So this is the glue that comes with the kit, your normal poly cement. And when I was an 8-year-old boy, this is the sort of thing that I would have used, and actually it creates an absolute mess. And in some cases, if you use too much, it just melts the model into a pile of plastic. So I may use some of this within the video build just to see what it's like and just remind myself of how hard modelling was back in the 70s and the 80s. Now, my go-to glue now is Tamiya Extra Thin. It's very different in how you apply this glue, but this stuff is, in my opinion, the best stuff you can use for gluing your plastic model together. This never used to be widely available in the UK up to a couple of years ago, and now you can get it quite easily from any online hobby store or Amazon or eBay, and this is the stuff that I've used since return to the hobby. It's absolutely fantastic. Probably in my experience of coming back to the hobby, this stuff is the stuff that revolutionised my model building. So they're your basic tools that you're going to need. There are other things that you need, and over the years I've built up many different things that I will show you in future builds and as I go through this one. But these are the tools that I'm going to use for this build, and try to keep it as basic and as minimal as possible, so that anybody could just go out and get any of these bits from a hobby store and you are ready to go with your model. So guys, let's get on with the build. The first thing we're going to do, we're going to build this pretty much straight out of the box. Out of the box is a term that modelers use for building the model pretty much straight out of the box without adding any what we call aftermarket details. There are lots of companies now that sell extra parts for your model to make it more detailed, to make it more realistic, and to give you the modeler a more of a challenge in creating a more detailed aircraft or tank or whatever you're building. But we're going to build what we call out of the box, so we're going to use just what's in the box with the use of some extra little bits here and there where I need to. What we're going to do first of all, we're going to build the seats, we're going to put the cockpit together, and we're going to build this first section, and I'll show you how to remove your plastic from the sprue and the basics of some painting and how to use the glue in this first section. So the instructions are telling us that we need to take off a couple of the seat part off this sprue. So I'm just going to show you how to use the sprue cutters. So the sprue cutters, the idea is that what you want to do is try to get as close to the plastic as you possibly can. With the flat end of your sprue cutters, without being careful not to take any other parts off, is trying to clip that off the plastic as close to as possible. The sharper and the better they are, the less it will pinch the plastic, and it should just cut down into the plastic. So this is the first part of the seat, and that was taken off quite quickly. Okay, and so I'll just remove the other parts, and then we'll talk about how we clean those parts up. So now we need to take the other part of the seat, again coming in quite close to the seat, so we have our parts. As you can see, they are the three parts that we need, okay? And these small number call-outs, these are the paints that we're gonna need to use, that are included within the model, okay? And so what we'll just go about doing now is I'm just going to show you how to clean the parts up once you've got them off the sprue, how to use the glue, and then we'll get into a little bit of painting as well. These skinny sanders, as they're called, are really quite handy for cleaning up tiny parts. What you want to do is just try to remove that excess plastic that was left when we cut it off the sprue, and making it nice and smooth, but also any flash or anything that's left over from the mold that is still on the plastic that's going to, you know, spoil the effect and spoil it. Okay, and so this is quite a light grip. I don't want to use anything too rough because it will just rip the plastic apart. It's important with these that you're not pushing too hard, you're letting the sander do most of the work. I was told by my dad, when you're cutting something with, you know, cutting wood with a saw, let the saw do the work, which is a bit of a random expression, considering the saw can't actually do anything unless you're using it. But I get the gist, is that you're not pushing too hard with the sanding stick or the saw, otherwise it just bites and grips and rips things apart and doesn't really create a very nice job. So that's how we sand our parts down. Now the key with this is always patience, time. The more you spend, the more patient you are, the better the result's going to be. And I know as a child I would rush through my model just because I wanted to get it done. And so it's important that you just take your time, and part of the joy of this hobby is the therapeutic part of just working away on something very slowly, just making sure you just do a really, really nice job. That brings me on to the use of your hobby knife. Sometimes you're going to want to take some parts off with a knife before you go in with the sander, because the sander, you know, it can take quite a long time, and you might just want to take some excess plastic off. When I was a child and I was making hobbies, I never used sanding sticks. I would always use my dad's scalpel, and I would take off the bits by almost like a potato peeler, just cutting bits off. The trouble with that is it's very hard to control, and often you would cut off bits that you didn't want to remove, and so it would just ruin your plastic a little bit. But you know, there's no reason why, if you've got good control, that you can use it. I was always taught never cut towards you, always cut away. but and I've cut myself many a time with a scalpel. Our parts are all cleaned up. Let's look at how we use the glue. The tamiarexothin is almost like a water liquid, and it comes with this little applicator, a little brush that you use to apply the glue. And as you may be able to see, it's very runny, and the whole basis of this is that it runs in between the gaps and glues and welds your stuff together. Before you glue your bits together, it's really important that you test fit your plastic to see how good your joint's going to be. And when you're happy, you can add the glue. Now, small parts like this, it's very difficult to hold them sometimes, so you could use a set of tweezers, or you get some a clothes peg or something to help you glue it together. But once you're happy, what you want to do is you take your applicator, you get rid of most of the excess off from the side of the bottle, and then you just apply it to the edge that you're trying to join, holding them together until it bites. It takes a few seconds just to bite and to start working, at which point you can let go. What's really important is that you keep your fingers out of the way. What you don't want is the glue getting underneath your fingers and then running out across the plastic. So be really careful when you're using this stuff. It uses what we call capillary action, which basically means it just runs down any gap that it finds. So if you use too much, it pulls and then it will go everywhere. And if you get it under your fingers, it will just use capillary action to just get in between all the gaps, and it will make a right mess. If you do make a mistake, or if you do use too much, the key thing is do not wipe it off. Just leave it to dry. I can see there's a little bit of pooling. If you just leave it to dry, it just evaporates and will not ruin your model. The moment you try to wipe that away, you'll just smear the plastic, because what it's doing, it's melting the plastic together. And so you do not want to touch it. If you make a mistake, just leave it for 5 minutes, let it dry completely, and it will just evaporate without any damage to the plastic whatsoever. So there's our ejection seat, all nice and tidied. We'll come along with a sanding stick in a few minutes, and just once it's dry, and just to give it a bit of a tidy up, just make sure it's all together. Okay, so that's the ejection seat. That's part one done. It suggests that we paint that now. I'm just going to leave that to dry before we paint it, and I'm just going to come on to part two and have a go at making these parts. And probably what I'll do is I'm going to make up to part 4 before I add these decals. Here it asks you to put some transfers, some water slide transfers down on to add the detail. In a lot of models the detail is paintable, but in this case because they're so small, we've got transfers to show the detail. And with the cockpit closed, you won't really see much of this anyway. So we're going to make this part here. We're going to get the pilot off. We'll put some of these bits together, and then in a few minutes time we'll come along with some paint. So I'm just going to get on with this and come back when we're ready to talk about the next part. Here's the control column for lightning. As you can see on the sprue, very, very small. It's very difficult sometimes to get these bits off. In this case, a part of it has come away. Now, if I try to get in with a set of these, the chances are you're just going to make a mess of it. So this is where your hobby knife can come in useful. One trick that I've learned from somebody else is, if you've got a small part that you want to get off, is use a bit of blue tack, and if you put the part on the blue tack like that, okay, and then you can get in with your knife, and that supports the part as you're cutting it off. And then I just use my knife to cut it off, and then as I take it away, it leaves it on the blue tack, in this case white tack, it's not blue at all, and then I can just remove that with a set of tweezers. Some of these parts are very small, so I use some of these magnifying glasses, which I use. My eyes are not as good as they used to, and certainly for the small parts when I'm putting together, I like to use a set of magnifying glasses. I've used various sorts, but I find these with the glasses arms really quite useful, and then you can just pivot that up out the way when you're not using it, so really useful to use. What we need to do here is a bit of flash on here, try to get some of that off.
sometimes just scraping the blade along the part to get the flash off is the best way of just getting some of this excess plastic that's left on there from the mould. So I just used the blade as a way of scratching off the seam lines that you can see. So let's clean that up a little bit, and I know I just need to cut a little bit off the bottom here. Just hold it really securely, and just, if you've got a really sharp knife, it will do it very easily. The important thing is it's got to be sharp, otherwise you're just going to butcher it. So they're the parts for the other parts for the cockpit. So let's find the pilot and stick him on. So here's our pilot. As you can see, he's got his little tab that's there, so we're just going to take our craft knife, we're going to hold him securely, and we're just going to leave, keeping the blades flat to the plastic, we're just going to trim that off. Okay, I'm just going to clean these up with a sanding stick. Back in a minute. The good thing about these sanding sticks is, especially the ones from flooring models, they're often double-sided. So we have a medium grit here, followed by a light grit. So you can come in with the medium grit, take off the excess plastic, and then come in with a light grit just to smoothen it out. Test fit our little ejector seat in there, and that fits beautifully. Yeah, that's a really good job. So here's the classic case where you don't want to always necessarily stick exactly rigidly to the instructions. Here it shows that this part should be attached to the seat after it's all been put in. I'm actually just going to attach that straight to the seat, so it just makes it a little bit easier to paint. Okay, so sometimes before you can just put the glue into where you want. So rather than just holding the bits together, and then you can come along before that dries out and stick your part in, and then come over and I'm just going to put some glue over that whole part just to smooth it out. And you can actually, I've found, you can sometimes use this as a bit like a filler, and just while the plastic it's melting the plastic, you can push some of that plastic into maybe some of your gaps and just smooth it out a bit. And so there's our ejection seat handles attached to the top of the ejection seat. Now what we have here is we have an ejection pin mark here that's been used to push the plastic out of the mould. Now sometimes you want to clean those up by running a sanding stick over them, okay, but in this case where it's hidden, you really don't need to worry about them. So let's just go ahead and stick that in. That sits nicely in there. There's our cockpit tub, ejection seat. We'll attach the stick a bit later, and then what we're gonna do now is we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna paint these ready to go in. Okay, so let's talk about the paints. So within the model you get 6 paints. They're all numbered according to the instructions. Slightly annoying that actually it doesn't tell you what the colour is. You sort of have to guess what the colour is. This is obviously a white. This is looks like some sort of silver. In fact, that looks like a silver. That looks like a green. That looks like some sort of black maybe. And so it would be helpful if Airfix actually within their instructions told you what the colours actually were, but they don't actually do that as far as I can tell. But that doesn't matter for this build. What would be useful is if you wanted to use them for another model that you know what the colours were. But these aren't the sort of paints that I use. The paints that I use these days, the one that I use the most probably is the Tamiya acrylic, and really good for airbrushing. And I use a variety of other paints as well. You can get specialist paints, so Vallejo Model Air, which is used for going through an airbrush. Again, a great paint and really useful. There's lots of other paints that I will talk about in future videos. But for now, we're gonna build what we get with the box, as though I'm just starting out on my modelling journey using the paints that I got. The only thing that I probably am going to need to do, because it's not included in the set, is use some flesh colour paint for his face. Okay, which I guess they're not going to stick a whole tub in just so you can paint the pilot's face. The brushes, you get 2 brushes. You get a number 4 brush, which is slightly long. It's got a nice point. It's not a bad little brush. A a number 4 brush, and then you get a number 0 brush, if that's the way you say it, a 0 brush, which you use for your detail. Now the one sort of brush that I would recommend you do get if you're going to paint this by hand, which is what I used to do, is get yourself a flat brush for painting the aircraft itself, because a flat brush will lay down large amounts of paint much more easily than a pointed brush. Depending on what you want to use, cheap ones often don't last as long and not as good quality, so sometimes it's worth spending a little bit of money on brushes. I tend to use a variety of brushes, but for most of my paint work, when I'm painting pilots and when I'm painting things, I use the Citadel range of brushes, because I find for the price you get a really good quality brush, and these have lasted me a long time, and then these are the ones I use when I'm painting the pilots and small detail parts. But for the most part I will use an airbrush to paint the actual aircraft itself. But in this case I'm going to go back to using brush and see if I can get a reasonable result with just using a brush rather than using my trusty airbrush. So for the face I'm going to use the Citadel Dwarf Flesh. I think the name's changed now, these are old set of paints, but I find the Games Workshop paints really quite good for brush painting, because they're designed to be used by a brush, not necessarily by airbrush. The Tamiya paints are really not very good for, they're really designed to be sprayed. They dry quite quickly, and so they're not very good for brush painting. So when I first started out and I was trying to use this with a brush, not at all good for brush painting. So you want to get a dedicated paint for brush painting. First off, we're going to start by painting the face. Being a primary school teacher for the last 13 years and teaching art lessons, the biggest issue I found with children is when they're painting, they just load their brush up without actually thinking about how much paint they've got on their brush, and they just slap it on without any care for actually what they're doing. I think the key thing is, when you're brush painting, is it's better to build it up in layers. If it doesn't go on first time, and cover up, let it dry, apply and apply again until you get what you want. Now in this case we can go over some of the areas because we will be able to cover that up. So I'm just going to get right in there and I'm just going to paint his face, not worrying too much about going over some of the helmets and some of the other details. So that's his face pretty much painted. I'm going to need to come in and do one more coat, but let's just leave that to dry on the side for a minute. Something you would often do as well is you would use a primer to prime your model. So it's always easier if you sprayed your model to lay down a primer. You could use just a car paint primer or a primer from a can, but to lay down a primer so that when you put your paint over, it's got something to bite to. Okay, when you're painting on the bare plastic, it's very difficult sometimes because it's a water-based. Some of these are water-based paints. It just doesn't want to stick down very well. Now, some paints are better than others, and some plastic's better than others. So, in the future, what you want to think about is how do you prime your parts. So, Games Workshop, they will do a spray primer for their miniatures, which you would spray over your entire model, and then you'll be able to come in and paint them. As you can see in these paint pots, the colour is very much separated and needs to have a good stir and a good shake. So the best thing you can do, give it a good shake before you start. Open it up. Now what I don't like about these, they can be a bit messy, and so what I always tend to do is I cut off the lid, because otherwise it just falls over, and it's just quite useful just to cut the lid off. Now what you want to do is you want to stir your paint, and what I always find useful here, whenever I go to McDonald's or to Starbucks or somewhere like that, pick up yourself some of these nice stirring sticks, and they are really useful for stirring your paint and nice and cheap as well. Although the seat calls out for different colours, I'm going to paint the whole thing with this first coat using this one colour. I'll have to do it in sections because it's difficult to hold on to it while I'm painting sections, and then that will serve as almost like a primer for the next colour. So as you can see as well, it's not going down very well, and so I'm just going to use a light layer first of all as a sort of primer, an undercoat as you like, and then come in and do another coat once that's dry, and just build up the layers. I think the important thing is with painting, just don't rush it and don't force it, okay, and don't leave loads of paint that are just going to dry into a pool and a horrible mess. So that's the first layer done. It's not covered particularly well, but the next layer should be a lot better. Okay, for the cockpit, I'm going to use a flat brush for this. Now I've picked up some pretty awful habits as a model, and I wouldn't suggest this, but I often just dampen my brush using my lips and my tongue sometimes, just to get the brush into a nice state ready for the painting. I wouldn't suggest necessarily do that, but I'm sure lots of models do the same. It's just a really bad habit that I got when I was into painting Warhammer miniatures, because I just couldn't be bothered to keep dipping it in the water all the time, and it just saved time. So I'm going to come in here and I'm just going to paint this whole cockpit with the same colour, and then we'll come out and pick out some of the details. Using the flat brush means that we can cover more area, and also it's just easier for applying it on flat surfaces. What can sometimes be useful is these tweezers that are able to, these locking tweezers, so you can hold some of your parts while you're painting them. At this stage I'm not worried about whether I go over any of the other parts and the details, because as I've laid down my main colour, I'm going to come in and add some detail later on. One thing I forgot to mention really at the beginning of the model, sometimes a lot of people think it's a good idea to wash your sprues, because often sometimes what happens is in the moulding process there's a residue of maybe some sort of oil or releasing agent that's left on the sprue that maybe makes it difficult for your paint to adhere. In my experience, I very rarely have ever washed the sprues and encountered really any major problems since I've come back to the hobby. But I guess if you want to be sure, just give them a good wash with soapy water if you want to make sure your sprues are nice and clean. Another tool that can be quite handy in the painting stage is a hairdryer, believe it or not. This was my wife's hairdryer before I bought a new one for her birthday, and it's really great at speeding up the drying process, so that you can get your paint down much quicker. Really speeds it up, because acrylic is a water-based paint, or alcohol-based in some cases, really dries really quickly, and so with a hairdryer you can just get it dry quicker. So ladies, if you're watching and your husband and you suddenly realise that your hairdryer's gone missing, you know why. The good thing about acrylic paints is that you can wash them out in water, and but they also dry completely waterproof and really are a really great choice for model making. In the old days, I used to use Umbro enamel paints, and they would take sometimes forever to dry, and then you get sticky fingers all over them, and they were an absolute nightmare to use. I still keep hold of them, some of these paints. These were my dad's, and some of these paints are over 30 years, 30 years old, and I've still got hold of them, and they're probably still quite useful. But I've gone away from the enamel paint to acrylics now. Now, the instructions show not too much detail. It says that the green for the helmet and for his trousers and his legs, and then there's this black section here, which I guess is the mask and his air pipe, and then his boots. But I'm going to just add a little bit more colour. I'm going to use my own initiative here and just add in a little bit of detail that's not suggested on here. If you really want to paint it properly, you probably want to have a look at some reference photos. Look on the internet and look for, you know, British pilots of the 1970s and 1980s, and just see how they'd worn, and then you can paint them as to what they actually look like, rather than just sticking to the plans itself. So it's always good to maybe have a look at some proper reference photos when you're painting. But I'm just going to come in, and I haven't got time for the reference photo, so I'm just going to come in and just add a little bit more detail. I'm just going to stick this guy onto a, hold him so it's a bit easier to hold, and get him into focus. There we go. So here he is. Now, what just happened there was the little part that I'd had was on my clippers, and it's just gone flying off. This happens on a regular basis when I'm modelling, and often we call it losing a part to the carpet monster, at which point I need to get down on my hands and knees and find out where it's got to. So that's the only drawback with using some of these, is sometimes your bit goes flying off and then it takes forever to try to find it. So I'll be back in a little while once I've found it. Okay, there's no way of finding that. I'm afraid that one's been lost to the carpet monster. And just so that we don't waste too much time on our build, I think what we'll do is we'll just say goodbye to that, because at the end of the day it's only the control stick, and where I'm going to close the cockpit up you won't see it anyway. So right, I'm going to stick the pilot to here. You know, gluing over the paint is not too bad, but you just need to make sure you get a nice good attachment. So I'm just going to put some glue around where the pilot's going to sit, stick him into position. Okay, and so there we have our pilot on our ejection seat, and then that will go into the cockpit tub in a moment. Okay, so there we have our sections ready. I'm just going to talk to you now about a little technique to bring out some of the detail within the pilot and around the cockpit, called dry brushing. Dry brushing is where we take a brush that's practically dry and then we drag it over the surface just to bring out the raised detail. First thing you're going to want is a really old brush where the bristles are really had it and really isn't much good for anything else. Dry brushing will ruin your brush, so don't go using a brand new brush, because it will absolutely ruin it. It will splay the hairs. So you want to use a really old brush. You can use a variety of colours. Now, the colours that come with the model aren't really appropriate. We have silvers, we have a white, and we have a green and a black. So I'm just going to use a different type of paint for this. So for dry brushing this, I'm just going to use some Games Workshop Citadel paint, some bleach bone, which is a sort of tanny beigey colour, which is a good general colour for doing some dry brushing. So I'm just going to show you the basics. So what you need is you need your paint, you need your old brush, and you need some kitchen towel. Now what you do is you get lots of paint onto your brush, and then into the kitchen towel. Just make sure it's really on the bristles, and then basically what you want to do is wipe off as much of that paint as you can. Okay, now I'm going to dip it in again, and I'm just going to do the same. Okay, and so the idea is now you want to wipe off as much of that paint onto that tissue as you can. You can experiment. Now the worst thing to do is put too much on, so start off by, it should be almost dry, hardly any paint coming off whatsoever. So let's zoom in and see if we can show you how to do this. So here we have our pilot. Now all I'm going to do is I'm just going to get the brush and drag it nice and quickly, not pressing too hard, over the whole thing, around the ejection seat, okay, and the helmet, across his face, hands, down his legs, okay, and so that, okay, let's bring this up, let's see if we can get this to focus. Here we have our pilot then, who's been dry brushed, and you might just be able to, in this light, see where the dry brushing has brought out a little bit of the detail in the pilot. Okay, so there he is. Now the one thing about this paint, and there's is that it's quite glossy, and so leaving off quite a sheen. Now in that case, what I would normally do is I'd spray over a matte coat just to dull it down a little bit, but in this case, because I'm making it straight out of the box, I'm just going to leave it as it is. It's not ideal, but yeah, I'd like to flatten that off really, rather than it being too shiny. Okay, one of the other things we can do is we can give the detail a wash. There are a variety of different products out there in the modelling world now that do this job. I tend to use a couple of different methods. Okay, so washes. Here are some products that I use. Not just these products, I've got some other things as well, but these are the main things that I would use for doing washes. So first of all, you have a dedicated, what we call an enamel wash, which you can use. Basically, my understanding is that it's just enamel paint that's been thinned using an enamel thinner to a point where it becomes less thick and it's more watery. The other thing I use, which at the beginning of my modelling journey a few years ago, is using the Flory wash. This is fantastic wash for bringing out detail on the main surface. It's not much good for doing stuff in your cockpit, although I have used it for the cockpit, but you just got to be a bit more careful. This is a clay water based wash, and when we come to the end of this build, I'll show you how you use it to bring out the detail in your whole kit. The other thing I've been doing more recently is I've been making my own washes using oil paints, and so this is a modelling variety of oil paint which I thinned down with enamel thinners or white spirit. I thin it down to a point where it becomes very, very diluted, and is very, very good for doing washes. And so at the moment, this is my preferred way of doing a wash. The only problem with this is it does take a little bit longer to dry because it is an oil-based paint rather than acrylic, or these ones are quite, they dry within 30 minutes, but this you need to leave a little bit longer sometimes. The other thing you can do is, if these things aren't readily available, then you could just try using some diluted ink. So here we have just some normal drawing Indian ink, which you can use to create your own wash. Now, what you don't want to do is use it straight out of the bottle, so you want to water it down to a point where it becomes very translucent and is ideal for using the wash. So we're going to use this, we're going to go back to as though I'm just starting out in the hobby and I haven't got all of these lovely products which can get quite expensive, and I'm just going to use an ink to bring out some of the detail. Sometimes paint lids can get a little bit stuck. I'm having trouble getting this one off. Now you can buy dedicated openers, but in my case, you can't beat a good wrench. Okay, and it's cheaper than those things that are specially made. Okay, so what we're going to do, we're going to make up a wash. I'm going to get my trusty little palette here. What we're going to do, we're going to take a tiny bit of ink into the palette, and then we're going to add some water. So I'll just put some on this side first, and then I'm going to add some water to this until I feel it's about right. Let's just get a trusty. What the idea is, we want to try to make it translucent, but without watering it down too much. So let's test that on an area where it's not going to notice too much. Okay, it's a little bit thick, so let's just try watering it down a bit more. I mean, it all adds to the effect of being slightly weathered and a bit old. And so, and then I can come in with a Q-tip, with a cotton bud or a Q-tip later on, just to tidy it up a little bit. The great stuff about this enamel wash is that once it's dry, you can come in with some enamel thinners, and you can clean up the bits that you don't want, because the enamel thinners won't affect the acrylic paint too much. The trouble is with doing it this way is because you're putting water based on water based. If you try to clean it up with some thinners for acrylics, it would just ruin the whole paintwork. So that's the great stuff about oil based stuff, is that you can swap between the two without ruining your paintwork. Right, so that's got a bit of a wash in there. It's a little bit over the top. I might come in with a cotton bud in a minute and just tidy that up, but it gives it an effect. It certainly looks better than it did. So with the pilot, I'm gonna water that down even more, and just come in here across the pilot. Now it's probably a little bit over the top, so let's just get it all there. Come into the seat as well. Seat. Right. Doesn't look too bad. I'm just going to come with the Q-tip, roll it over, get rid of some of the excess paint. Okay, and there we have him. So that's our wash done. I mean, I wouldn't tend to use inks these days. You can do, but there's many of these products now. They're quite expensive. You can make your own, of course, but I quite like the ease of having all these, and being a bit of a collector, I like to collect all these things, and got quite a range going on now. What we're going to talk about now, we're going to talk about the decals. We're going to put these parts on here onto the model. When you're decaling, what you want to do is have a pair of scissors where you can cut out your decals. Now I have a pair of dedicated decal scissors for this, but it's really handy just to get out the bits that you want. Okay, so those are the bits that we're going to need for the cockpit. Okay, decaling then. So what I've got here, I've got a little plastic tray that I'm going to put some water into. Now if I'm doing a large amount of decaling, what I'll do is get a bowl of warm, tepid water that I would use, but in this case I just like to use a little plastic tray. I'm going to lay that in there for a little while. This is something I often rush, so I'm just going to give it some time to just make sure you get it all covered. Okay, and leave that in there for just a little while. It's saying that we need to put the decals on the sides of the cockpit here and on the instrument panel. What I do now is I'm going to take my decals out. I'm just going to place them onto my surface. Obviously what we'll do is when we come to doing the main decaling of the aircraft, we will go into some detail about some of the products that you can use. But right now all I'm going to do is I'm just going to get these bits on and not talk too much about what's available. Now what I do have is that I have a nice flat brush which I use, really nice quality sable brush that I only use for my decaling. Okay, and what I do is I just tap the decal and to see just if it's moving. So these two are moving now, and what I try to do, I like to get my brush either you get your decal onto the edge of an area and then you can slide it off, or I like to get my brush underneath it to see if I can get the decal off that way. So in this case what I'm going to do, I'm just going to bring it to the edge and then I just pick it up with my brush. Okay, and then this decal is just going to be placed in here, and then I move it into the position with the brush. And you could use a cocktail stick or a pair of tweezers just to move it into position. I'm going to use a pair of tweezers here, it might be a bit easier. What I then like to do is get a cotton bud and just roll it over the top just to get it nice and in position. So that's the first decal on. Okay, then we're going to do the other side. So, right, that bit come off on my finger as I was touching it. I had to be a bit careful. Now, it has to be said that decaling is probably my worst part of modelling. It's the bit I like least out of all of it. It's the place where I make the most mistakes and where I mess things up. So, I don't particularly enjoy it, but it's a bit that has to be done. So let's get that into place. Bit of water underneath to get it, help it move around. Okay, and so that's the next instrument panel. Now, chances are you're probably not going to be able to see any of this detail once the cockpit's all shut up. Okay, and it's not particularly realistic in any way, but hey ho, we're just building this out of the box. Ideally, what you'd like is a raised panel, and then you could dry brush some of those raised parts to make it look a little bit more realistic. But not too bad. They're a little bit too large for the model. They don't quite fit in place, but somehow we'll get them down. There are products to help you, and we'll talk about those, as I said, when we do the main decaling of the whole thing. Okay. I'm not going to worry too much. Right, I can see this area is where sometimes you may get a little bit frustrated because it's not going down. Okay. Push that forward a bit. That's it. Right, then just roll it out. Okay. And then the main instrument panel. Underneath it. And put that in place. Oops, that just moved. Let's move it back. Okay, and so there's the main instrument panel in there as well. Don't know if you can see it. There you go. There's the instrument panel in there, like so. It doesn't look too bad, and from a distance it looks okay. Right, now we're going to put our pilot in. So we'll just get some glue, a little bit about where it's got to attach to, and then I'm going to put our pilot into position. And so there we have our pilot and cockpit. If it just focus, there we go. So there's our cockpit and pilot. So that's all completed. Right, let's tidy up these bits and then we're going to get on to the next part of the build.